The winter rain in Seattle had been relentless for 3 straight weeks, turning the city's streets into glistening ribbons of asphalt that reflected the neon glow of coffee shops and tech company logos. From the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, the drops created intricate patterns on the floor-to-ceiling windows, distorting the view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. It was nearly 1:30 a.m. on a Thursday in late November, and the building that housed Technova Industries should have been empty except for the overnight security guards and the automated systems that kept the servers humming in the basement data centers. But in a modest cubicle tucked away in the northeast corner of the 38th floor, Maria Elena Vasquez sat hunched over her computer screen, her dark eyes moving methodically across columns of numbers that told a story she was beginning to understand with growing alarm. At 28, Maria had been working as a senior financial analyst at Technova for 3 years and 2 months, building a reputation as one of the most thorough and reliable members of the accounting department. Her colleagues respected her attention to detail, her willingness to work late when necessary, and her ability to find discrepancies that others missed. Her workspace was a study in organized efficiency. Color-coded folders stood in perfect rows along the back edge of her desk, each labeled with precise handwriting that reflected her methodical approach to financial analysis. A small jade plant that her mother had given her when she started at Technova sat next to her computer monitor, somehow thriving under the harsh fluorescent lights that never quite turned off completely. Beside the plant was a framed photograph from her college graduation. Her parents, Roberto and Carmen Vasquez, beaming with pride as their daughter became the first person in their family to earn a bachelor's degree. The path to this moment had been anything but easy for Maria. Her parents had immigrated to the United States from Guadalajara when she was 6 years old, carrying little more than hopes for a better life and an unshakable belief in the power of education and hard work. Roberto had found employment with the United States Postal Service, while Carmen had worked her way up from a hospital cleaning crew to become a licensed practical nurse. For 18 years, they had sacrificed virtually everything to ensure that Maria and her younger brother Carlos could have opportunities that had been denied to them in Mexico. The sacrifices had been enormous and constant. Roberto had worked double shifts during the holidays, delivering packages in the rain and snow while other families gathered around warm dinner tables. Carmen had taken on extra nursing shifts at the hospital, often working 16-hour days during flu season and holiday staffing shortages. They had lived in the same modest 2-bedroom apartment in the Rainier Valley for over 20 years, driving the same used Honda Civic that Roberto had bought with cash in 2003, saving every possible dollar for their children's education. Maria had never forgotten the weight of those sacrifices. Even now, sitting in her climate-controlled office, wearing clothes that cost more than her parents had spent on themselves in months, she could remember the sound of her father's alarm clock going off at 4:30 a.m. and the sight of her mother's tired eyes as she returned home from another double shift. Those memories had driven her through 4 years at the University of Washington, where she had graduated summa cum laude with a double major in accounting and finance, and through the grueling process of earning her CPA certification while working full-time in entry-level positions. Technova had represented the culmination of years of careful career planning and relentless professional development. The company was founded 8 years earlier by Alexander Reeves, a brilliant and ruthless entrepreneur who had transformed a small artificial intelligence startup into one of the most valuable technology companies in the Pacific Northwest. At 35, Reeves was worth an estimated $2.8 billion, making him one of the youngest billionaires in the world and a fixture on magazine covers and conference stages throughout the technology industry. The company specialized in developing AI solutions for healthcare, finance, and logistics, with flagship products that had revolutionized everything from medical imaging analysis to supply chain optimization. Their Medicore system could identify potential tumors in X-rays and CT scans with greater accuracy than human radiologists, while their Logiflow platform had reduced shipping costs and delivery times for dozens of major retailers. The technology was genuinely groundbreaking, and the company's rapid growth had created thousands of high-paying jobs throughout the Seattle metropolitan area. But success had come at a cost that was becoming increasingly apparent to those who worked closely with the company's financial operations. Alexander Reeves was notorious for his demanding work schedule and his expectation that employees match his own relentless pace. He regularly sent emails at 2:00 a.m. and expected responses within hours, regardless of the recipient's position in the company hierarchy or their personal circumstances. His management style was characterized by sudden reorganizations, brutal performance reviews, and a willingness to publicly humiliate employees who failed to meet his exacting standards. The corporate culture at Teknova reflected Reeves's personality in ways that were both inspiring and troubling. On one hand, the company attracted some of the brightest minds in the technology industry, offering competitive salaries, generous stock options, and the opportunity to work on projects that could genuinely improve millions of lives. The engineering teams were given remarkable freedom to pursue innovative solutions, and the company's commitment to cutting-edge research had resulted in dozens of patents and breakthrough technologies. On the other hand, the pressure to maintain the company's growth trajectory had created an environment where employees were afraid to question decisions, raise concerns, or admit mistakes. Turnover in certain departments exceeded 40% annually, with many talented professionals leaving for competitors after burning out under the intense demands of their positions. Exit interviews consistently cited management pressure, unrealistic deadlines, and a lack of work-life balance as primary reasons for departure. Maria had been largely insulated from the worst aspects of Teknova's culture during her first 2 years with the company. The accounting department was viewed as a necessary but unglamorous support function, and most senior executives paid little attention to the day-to-day operations of financial analysis and reporting. She had been able to focus on developing her skills and building relationships with colleagues who shared her commitment to accuracy and professional excellence. But her recent promotion to senior financial analyst had given her access to more sensitive information and broader responsibility for monitoring the company's financial health. It was in this expanded role that she had begun to notice irregularities that troubled her both professionally and personally. The patterns were subtle at first. Consulting fees that seemed slightly excessive, travel expenses that didn't quite align with known business activities, and vendor payments that were difficult to trace through normal verification channels. As she delved deeper into the quarterly expense reports, the irregularities became more pronounced and more systematic. There were payments to consulting firms that didn't appear in any standard business databases, travel expenses for trips that weren't reflected in executive calendars or meeting schedules, and transfers to offshore entities that weren't properly documented in the company's financial systems. The amounts involved were staggering, potentially tens of millions of dollars over the past 18 months. Tonight's marathon work session had begun at 6:00 a.m. the previous day, when Maria had arrived early to review the preliminary numbers for the third quarter financial statements. What should have been a routine analysis had turned into an exhaustive investigation that consumed her entire day and stretched well into the night. She had cross-referenced vendor databases, analyzed payment patterns, and traced financial flows through multiple layers of corporate entities and bank accounts. The more she investigated, the more convinced she became that someone with high-level access to Teknova's financial systems was deliberately manipulating expense reports and vendor payments to hide the true nature of certain transactions. The scheme was sophisticated and carefully concealed, involving shell companies, complex payment structures, and documentation that was technically compliant with accounting standards, but designed to obscure, rather than illuminate, the underlying business purposes. As a certified public accountant, Maria understood both the legal and ethical obligations that governed her profession. The AICPA Code of Professional Conduct was clear about her responsibilities when she encountered potential fraud or financial irregularities. She was required to exercise professional skepticism, gather sufficient evidence to support her concerns, and report her findings to appropriate authorities within the organization or, if necessary, to external regulatory agencies. But Maria also understood the practical realities of challenging powerful people within large corporations. She had read about other whistleblowers who had lost their jobs, been blacklisted from their industries, and faced years of legal battles and financial hardship. The protections offered by federal law were substantial in theory, but often inadequate in practice, particularly for employees who lacked the resources to sustain prolonged legal challenges against wealthy defendants. As she sat in her cubicle in the early hours of Thursday morning, organizing her findings and preparing her documentation, Maria thought about her parents sleeping in their small apartment across the city. Roberto would be getting up in 3 hours to begin his morning postal route, while Carmen was working the night shift at Swedish Medical Center. They had sacrificed so much to give her the education and opportunities that had brought her to this moment, and she knew they would expect her to do the right thing regardless of the personal consequences. The weight of that expectation was both comforting and terrifying. Maria had been raised to believe that integrity was more valuable than any material possession and that honest work was the foundation of a meaningful life. Her parents had demonstrated those values through decades of sacrifices and challenges, never compromising their principles, even when doing so might have provided short-term benefits or easier paths forward. But she also knew that her decision would affect more than just her own career prospects. If her suspicions were correct and Teknova was engaged in systematic financial fraud, the consequences could extend to thousands of employees, millions of shareholders, and countless customers who depended on the company's products. The Medicor system was being used in hospitals throughout the country, helping doctors diagnose cancer and other serious conditions. The LogIFlow platform was integrated into supply chains that delivered essential goods to communities across North America. The thought that the company behind these vital technologies might be built on a foundation of fraud and deception made Maria's stomach clench with anxiety and determination. She understood that remaining silent might protect her own immediate interests, but it could also enable continued wrongdoing that might eventually cause far greater harm to far more people. At 2:15 a.m., Maria made copies of the most suspicious documents, organizing them into carefully labeled folders that she secured in her locked desk drawer. She created encrypted backups of all relevant electronic files, storing them on multiple devices that she kept in separate locations. If her suspicions proved correct, this evidence might be crucial for any future investigation, and she wanted to ensure that it couldn't be destroyed or suppressed by anyone seeking to cover up potential wrongdoing. As she prepared to leave the office, Maria noticed the small security cameras mounted in the corners of the room, their red lights blinking steadily as they recorded everything that happened in the workspace. She had grown so accustomed to their presence that she rarely thought about them, but tonight their constant surveillance felt ominous and intrusive. She wondered who might be watching the footage and what conclusions they might draw from her unusual work schedule and obvious focus on sensitive financial documents. What Maria didn't know was that Alexander Reeves had implemented a comprehensive monitoring system throughout Teknova's offices 8 months earlier, ostensibly to protect the company's intellectual property and prevent corporate espionage. The system included not only traditional security cameras, but also sophisticated software that could track employee computer usage, monitor email communications, and analyze patterns of movement and behavior throughout the building. Reeves had justified the extensive surveillance as a necessary security measure, given the sensitive nature of the company's research and the significant value of its proprietary technologies. But the reality was more complex and troubling. The monitoring system had become an extension of Reeves's controlling personality, allowing him to maintain detailed oversight of his employees' activities even when he wasn't physically present in the office. From his penthouse office on the 45th floor, Reeves could access live feeds from any camera in the building, review recordings from previous days or weeks, and generate detailed reports about employee productivity, communication patterns, and compliance with company policies. He had become obsessed with the system, often spending hours late at night reviewing footage and analyzing data about his employees' behavior and activities. The surveillance system generated automated alerts for unusual activity patterns, flagging employees who worked significantly longer hours than normal, accessed sensitive databases outside their normal job functions, or exhibited other behaviors that might indicate security concerns or policy violations. It was one of these automated alerts that first brought Maria's recent activities to Reeves's attention. The system had flagged Maria's extended work sessions, her access to historical financial databases, and her printing of large volumes of documents related to vendor payments and expense reports. The initial alert had been routine. The system regularly identified employees whose work patterns deviated from normal baselines, but Reeves's review of the associated footage and data logs had revealed activities that concerned him significantly. Over the past 2 weeks, Maria had accessed financial records spanning 3 years of company operations, focusing particularly on consulting payments, travel expenses, and transactions involving offshore entities. Her computer usage patterns indicated that she was conducting systematic analysis rather than routine reporting, and the volume of documents she had printed suggested that she was building a comprehensive file of potentially sensitive information. Initially, Reeves had dismissed Maria's activities as the overenthusiasm of a relatively junior employee trying to demonstrate her value to the organization. But as the pattern continued and intensified, his concern had grown into something approaching paranoia. The financial irregularities that Maria was investigating were not random accounting errors or clerical mistakes. They were the result of a carefully orchestrated scheme that Reeves had developed to provide himself with financial flexibility that couldn't be scrutinized by shareholders, regulatory authorities, or even his own board of directors. The scheme had been operating for nearly 3 years, diverting approximately $47 million in company funds for purposes that ranged from personal investments to political contributions that violated federal campaign finance laws. The money had been channeled through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts, with transactions disguised as legitimate business expenses and consulting fees. In Reeves's mind, the diversions were justified by the extraordinary value he had created for Technova and its stakeholders. The company's market capitalization had increased by over $4 billion during his tenure as CEO, generating enormous wealth for shareholders and creating thousands of high-paying jobs. A few accounting irregularities were a small price to pay for maintaining the competitive advantages and strategic flexibility that had enabled such remarkable success. But Maria's investigation threatened to expose the entire operation, potentially triggering regulatory investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and criminal charges that could destroy everything Reeves had built. The realization that a junior financial analyst had identified patterns that had been carefully concealed for years filled him with a rage that was both personal and professional. On Thursday morning, as Maria arrived at the office after only 3 hours of sleep, Reeves was already in his executive suite, reviewing the latest surveillance reports and planning his response to what he now viewed as a direct threat to his company and his personal freedom. The time for passive monitoring had passed. He needed to confront the situation directly and decisively. The Technova headquarters occupied 15 floors of the Meridian Tower, with executive offices on the top 3 levels and operational departments spread throughout the remaining space. The building's design reflected the company's culture and values, with open floor plans that encourage collaboration, state-of-the-art technology infrastructure, and expensive artwork that demonstrated the organization's financial success and sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. Reeves's office on the 45th floor was a monument to corporate power and personal achievement, designed to intimidate visitors and reinforce the hierarchical relationships that defined the company's organizational structure. The space occupied nearly a quarter of the entire floor, with panoramic windows offering breathtaking views of Puget Sound, the Space Needle, and the snow-capped peaks of the Olympic Mountains. The office was furnished with pieces that had been selected as much for their historical significance as for their aesthetic appeal. The massive mahogany desk had once belonged to railroad baron James J. Hill, while the conference table was crafted from wood, salvaged from a 19th-century sailing ship. Original paintings by prominent Pacific Northwest artists covered the walls, and carefully arranged awards and photographs documented Reeves's rise from startup founder to billionaire technology mogul. At 10:30 a.m. on Thursday morning, as Technova employees throughout the building settled into their daily routines, Reeves instructed his assistant to summon Maria to his office immediately. The message was delivered with the kind of urgency that left no room for delay or explanation, and within minutes, Maria found herself in the elevator ascending to the executive floors with a growing sense of dread. The elevator ride seemed to last forever, each floor marking her ascent toward what she instinctively understood might be the most important confrontation of her career. Maria clutched a folder containing copies of the most significant documents she had discovered, uncertain whether she would need them as evidence or as protection against whatever accusations might come. As the elevator doors opened onto the 45th floor, Maria was struck by the dramatic change in atmosphere from the operational levels below. The executive floor was quieter, more luxurious, and somehow more intimidating than the open, collaborative spaces where she normally worked. Expensive carpeting muffled the sound of footsteps, while original artwork and carefully arranged furniture created an environment that felt more like an exclusive club than a corporate office. Reeves's assistant, Jennifer Morrison, greeted Maria with professional courtesy but obvious nervousness. At 42, Jennifer had worked for Reeves for nearly 6 years, long enough to recognize the warning signs of his legendary temper and to understand when a meeting was likely to be particularly difficult. The tension in her demeanor was palpable as she escorted Maria to the massive oak doors that led to Reeves's private office. The office itself was even more imposing than Maria had imagined. The sheer scale of the space was overwhelming, designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant in comparison to the man who commanded such luxury and authority. Behind his enormous desk, Alexander Reeves sat like a judge preparing to render verdict, his pale blue eyes studying Maria with the cold calculation of a predator who had cornered his prey. At 35, Reeves possessed the kind of commanding presence that came from years of wielding absolute authority over thousands of employees and billions of dollars in resources. His thick, dark hair was perfectly styled. His expensive charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, and his entire demeanor radiated the confidence of someone who was accustomed to having his words treated as law. But as Maria looked more closely, she could detect subtle signs of stress and agitation, a slight tension around his eyes, a barely perceptible tightness in his jaw, and hands that moved with more energy than the situation seemed to warrant. "Miss Vasquez," Reeves began, his voice carrying the silky menace of someone who was accustomed to using intimidation as a management tool. "Please have a seat. I understand you've been working some very long hours lately." "Nah." Maria settled into one of the leather chairs facing Reeves's desk, drawing strength from the memory of her parents' teachings about facing adversity with dignity and courage. "Yes, sir. I've been conducting a comprehensive review of our quarterly expense reports and related financial documentation." "How comprehensive?" Reeves asked, leaning back in his chair and studying Maria's face for signs of weakness or deception. "Very comprehensive, sir. I've been analyzing expense patterns across multiple departments and time periods to ensure accuracy and compliance with generally accepted accounting principles and federal regulations." Reeves smiled, but the expression held no warmth or genuine humor. "And what have you discovered in your analysis, Ms. Vasquez? I'm very interested in your conclusions about our financial operations." The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung, and Maria understood that her next words would determine not only the trajectory of this conversation, but possibly the entire future of her career. She thought about the evidence she had gathered, the irregularities she had documented, and the professional obligations that governed her responsibilities as a certified public accountant. More importantly, she thought about her parents and the values they had instilled in her through years of sacrifice and example. Roberto and Carmen Vasquez had never had the luxury of choosing between their principles and their immediate self-interest. Their entire lives had been built on the belief that honest work and moral integrity were more valuable than any material comfort or social status. "I've discovered several irregularities that concern me significantly, sir," Maria said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Expense patterns and payment structures that don't appear to align with standard business practices or regulatory requirements." Reeves's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a flash of anger or perhaps fear. "Irregularities. Could you be more specific about these supposed irregularities?" Maria opened her folder and removed several documents, placing them on the polished surface of Reeves's desk. "Consulting payments that can't be verified through normal vendor databases, travel expenses that don't correspond to any business activities I can identify in company records, and transfer payments to offshore entities that aren't properly documented in our financial systems." And as Reeves glanced at the documents, copies of some of the most sensitive records related to his financial diversions, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. These were documents that should have been accessible only to a very limited number of senior executives, and seeing them in the hands of a junior analyst was both shocking and terrifying. "Ms. Vasquez," Reeves said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "do you understand what you're suggesting? Do you comprehend the implications of what you're saying?" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir," Maria replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm reporting what I've found in my analysis of the company's financial records. As a certified public accountant, I have professional and ethical obligations that require me to identify and report potential irregularities." Reeves stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward with enough force to hit the credenza behind his desk. "Professional obligations, ethical obligations. Let me tell you about obligations, Ms. Vasquez." He began pacing behind his desk, his movements sharp and agitated, as his carefully maintained composure began to crack under the pressure of Maria's quiet persistence. "You have an obligation to this company that pays your salary, provides your health insurance, and gives you the opportunity to build a career in one of the most innovative organizations in the technology industry." Maria remained silent, recognizing that Reeves was building toward something that would be both revealing and dangerous. "You have an obligation to the thousands of employees whose jobs depend on Technova's continued success and growth," Reeves continued, his voice growing louder and more intense. "You have an obligation to the millions of patients whose lives are improved by our medical AI systems, and to the countless businesses whose operations are optimized by our logistics platforms. The pacing became more frantic as Reeves warmed to his theme, gesturing emphatically as he outlined what he saw as the broader implications of Maria's investigation. "And most importantly," he said, turning to face her directly, "you have an obligation to understand your place in this organization and to respect the authority and judgment of those who have built something extraordinary from nothing." The threat was implicit but unmistakable, and Maria felt her heart rate increase as she recognized the dangerous territory they were entering. But she also felt a growing sense of clarity about what was at stake and what her response needed to be. "I understand my obligations, sir," Maria said quietly. "All of them, including my obligation to ensure that this company operates in compliance with federal laws and ethical standards that protect investors, employees, and the public." Reeves moved closer to her chair, looming over her in a way that was clearly intended to be intimidating. "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to undermine this company based on your limited understanding of complex business arrangements that are far beyond your level of expertise or authority." He gestured dismissively toward the documents on his desk. "These irregularities you've identified are perfectly legitimate business expenses that serve important strategic purposes. The fact that you don't understand them doesn't make them suspicious. It makes you presumptuous and potentially dangerous to the organization that employs you." Maria felt her anger rising, but she forced herself to remain calm and professional, despite the increasing hostility of Reeves's approach. "Sir, with respect, some of these payments appear to violate generally accepted accounting principles and potentially federal regulations regarding corporate disclosure and transparency." "Enough!" Reeves exploded, his composure finally cracking completely under the pressure of Maria's quiet persistence. "I caught you red-handed, trying to sabotage this company with your amateur investigation and your sanctimonious lecturing about ethics and regulations." The words echoed through the spacious office, and Maria could see Jennifer Morrison and several other employees in the adjacent areas looking up in alarm at the sound of raised voices. The glass partition that separated Reeves's office from the outer reception area provided no sound insulation, and his outburst was clearly audible to anyone working on the executive floor. "You think you're some kind of crusader for justice," Reeves continued, his voice still elevated but slightly more controlled as he became aware of the attention his shouting had attracted. "But you're nothing more than a junior analyst who stumbled across information you're not qualified to interpret and decided to play detective instead of doing your actual job." Maria stood slowly, maintaining her composure despite the verbal assault and the obvious intimidation tactics being employed against her. "Mr. Reeves, I'm not trying to sabotage anything. I'm trying to protect this company from potential legal and financial liability that could result from improper financial practices." "Protect the company?" Reeves laughed harshly, a sound that held no humor and conveyed only contempt and disbelief. "You're about to destroy the company with your misguided crusade and your complete lack of understanding about how successful businesses actually operate." He moved to the window, staring out at the city below, as if contemplating the destruction that Maria's discoveries might bring to everything he had built. "Do you have any idea what happens when someone makes wild accusations about financial irregularities? Do you understand the kind of regulatory scrutiny and media attention that follows?" The view from his office encompassed much of downtown Seattle, including the headquarters of several other major technology companies and the construction sites where new office towers were rising to accommodate the region's continued economic growth. From this height, the people on the streets looked like ants, scurrying about their business, with no real understanding of the forces that shaped their economic opportunities and quality of life. Investigations, audits, lawsuits, criminal charges, all based on the confused interpretations of a junior employee who doesn't understand the first thing about running a billion-dollar company or competing in the global technology marketplace, Reeves said, his voice taking on a tone of bitter resignation mixed with growing anger. Maria remained standing, her folder of documents clutched in her hands like a shield against the barrage of accusations and threats. "Sir, if the practices are legitimate, then a proper investigation would clear the company and strengthen its reputation. If they're not legitimate, then the company needs to address them before they become a much bigger problem." Reeves turned back to face her, his expression a mixture of fury and calculating coldness. "Ms. Vasquez, you have exactly one chance to salvage your career and avoid destroying everything you've worked for. You will return to your desk, delete any copies of these documents you may have made, and forget that this conversation ever happened." The ultimatum was delivered with the absolute authority of someone who was accustomed to having his commands obeyed without question or delay. But Maria had come too far to back down now, and she understood that accepting Reeves's demand would make her complicit in whatever scheme she had uncovered. "I can't do that, sir," she said simply. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, transforming the dynamic of the conversation in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated. Reeves had expected compliance, perhaps grudging and resentful, but compliance nonetheless. Maria's quiet refusal represented a challenge to his authority that he had rarely encountered and was unprepared to handle effectively. "You can't," Reeves repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or you won't." "Both, sir. I can't ethically ignore what I've discovered, and I won't be intimidated into abandoning my professional responsibilities and legal obligations." Reeves walked back to his desk and pressed a button on his phone system. "Security, I need you in my office immediately. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention." As they waited for security to arrive, the two adversaries studied each other across the expensive office space. Reeves saw a young woman who represented everything he despised about the current generation of employees: idealistic, inflexible, and dangerously naive about the realities of business competition and corporate governance. Maria saw a powerful man who had allowed success and wealth to corrupt his judgment and who was now threatening to destroy anyone who challenged his authority or questioned his methods. The security team that responded to Reeves's call consisted of 3 officers, 2 large men in navy blue uniforms who had clearly been briefed on the situation, and a woman who appeared to be their supervisor. All 3 had the professional demeanor of experienced security personnel, but Maria could see uncertainty in their expressions as they assessed the situation they had been called to address. "Ms. Vasquez is terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct and violation of company policies," Reeves announced, his voice carrying the finality of an imperial decree. "Escort her to her desk to collect her personal belongings, then escort her from the building. Her access to all company systems and facilities is revoked permanently, and she is not to return to these premises for any reason." The lead security officer, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had worked in corporate security for over 15 years, looked uncomfortable with the instructions she had received. "Sir, are there any specific policies that Ms. Vasquez has violated? We're required to document the reasons for any termination that involves security escort." Reeves's jaw tightened at the question, but he recognized the need to provide some justification for his actions. "Unauthorized access to confidential financial information, potential theft of proprietary documents, and insubordination during a disciplinary meeting. That should be sufficient documentation for your purposes." As the security officers moved to flank Maria, she looked directly at Reeves and spoke words that would haunt him for years to come. "Mr. Reeves, terminating me won't make the irregularities disappear. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, and when it does, you'll wish you had listened to someone who was trying to help rather than destroy. She paused, gathering her thoughts for what she knew might be her final words as a Technova employee. You built this company on innovation and the promise of making the world a better place. Don't let your pride and fear destroy everything that thousands of people have worked to create. With that, Maria walked out of the office with as much dignity as she could muster, her head held high, despite the humiliation of being escorted out by security guards. As she made her way through the executive floor toward the elevators, she could see other employees watching through glass partitions and doorways, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and fear. The elevator ride down to the 38th floor felt like a descent into a different world. Just minutes earlier, Maria had been a valued employee with a promising career trajectory and the respect of her colleagues. Now, she was being escorted out of the building like a criminal, her professional reputation potentially destroyed by a man who had the power to rewrite the narrative of their confrontation. At her cubicle, Maria collected the few personal belongings that hadn't been locked away in her desk drawer. The photograph of her parents, her jade plant, and a few items of clothing she kept for working late. The security officers allowed her 5 minutes to gather her things, standing close enough to ensure that she couldn't access her computer or remove any additional documents. As she worked, Maria could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, their confusion and concern palpable in the suddenly quiet office environment. Many of them had worked with her for months or years, and they knew her as a dedicated professional who took her responsibilities seriously. The sight of her being escorted out by security was shocking and disturbing, raising questions about what could have possibly led to such a dramatic outcome. David Park, a senior analyst who had mentored Maria during her first year at Technova, approached the security perimeter with obvious concern. "Maria, is there anything I can do? Is there someone I should call?" Maria looked at him with gratitude and sadness, recognizing that their professional relationship was ending under circumstances that neither of them could have anticipated. "Thank you, David. Just remember that sometimes doing the right thing requires more courage than doing the easy thing." The cryptic response was all she could offer without potentially implicating David in whatever consequences might follow from her investigation. But she hoped that her words might plant a seed of awareness that could grow into action if the irregularities she had discovered eventually came to light through other means. The final leg of her journey out of Technova took her through the main lobby, past the expensive artwork and sleek furniture that had once made her proud to work for such a successful and innovative company. Now, those same symbols of corporate achievement felt like monuments to arrogance and the abuse of power, reminders that success without integrity was ultimately hollow and dangerous. Outside the building, the Seattle rain continued to fall with the relentless persistence that characterized the Pacific Northwest's winter weather. Maria stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, allowing the cold drops to hit her face as she processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the span of less than 2 hours, her life had been fundamentally altered by a conversation that had exposed the true character of a man she had once respected and admired. The drive to her apartment in the Ballard neighborhood took her through the heart of Seattle's technology corridor, past the gleaming office buildings that housed some of the world's most innovative companies. As she sat in traffic, Maria reflected on the morning's events and tried to process the complex emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Anger at Reeves's arrogance and intimidation tactics, fear about her professional future, and determination to ensure that the truth about Technova's financial irregularities eventually came to light. Her apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit that she shared with her college roommate, Lisa Wong, who worked as a software engineer for a smaller technology company in South Lake Union. Lisa was at work when Maria arrived home, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the daunting task of deciding what to do next. The apartment's living room was furnished with pieces that Maria and Lisa had accumulated over several years. A comfortable couch from a second-hand store, a coffee table that Lisa had built herself, and bookshelves lined with technical manuals, novels, and photographs from their college years and early careers. It was a space that reflected their shared values of practicality, friendship, and the gradual accumulation of small comforts that made life more pleasant and meaningful. But today, the familiar surroundings felt strange and uncertain, as if Maria's professional crisis had somehow infected every aspect of her life. She made a cup of coffee and sat at the small dining table where she had spent countless hours studying for her CPA exam and working on freelance accounting projects to supplement her income during her early career. Now, that same table became the command center for what she recognized would be the most important project of her professional life. Maria spread out copies of the documents she had discovered, organizing them chronologically and by type of irregularity. She reviewed her notes and analysis, double-checking her conclusions and ensuring that her documentation was comprehensive and accurate. The evidence was damning and extensive. Over the course of nearly 3 years, someone with high-level access to Technova's financial systems had systematically diverted company funds through a network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent expense reports. The scheme had generated approximately $47 million in unauthorized payments, disguised as legitimate business expenses and consulting fees. The sophistication of the operation suggested involvement by someone with intimate knowledge of corporate finance and regulatory requirements. The transactions were structured to avoid triggering automatic audit alerts, while the documentation was technically compliant with accounting standards, but designed to obscure rather than illuminate the true nature of the underlying business purposes. As Maria continued her analysis, she became increasingly convinced that Alexander Reeves himself was the primary architect of the scheme. His reaction to her investigation, his detailed knowledge of the specific documents she had discovered, and his willingness to terminate her rather than address her concerns all pointed to personal involvement in the fraudulent activities. But proving Reeves's culpability would require resources and expertise that Maria didn't possess as an individual. The financial structures involved were complex and international in scope, involving entities and transactions that would require subpoena power and forensic accounting specialists to fully unravel. What she could provide was a roadmap for investigators and sufficient evidence to trigger the kind of comprehensive audit that would expose the full scope of the fraud. That evening, Maria called her parents to explain what had happened and to prepare them for the possibility that her professional situation might become public and controversial. The conversation was difficult and emotional, forcing her to describe not only her termination, but also the circumstances that had led to her confrontation with Reeves. Roberto and Carmen Vasquez listened with the patient attention they had always given to their daughter's concerns and challenges. As immigrants who had faced their own struggles with powerful institutions and authority figures, they understood both the courage required to challenge wrongdoing and the potential consequences of speaking truth to power. "Misha," her father said, when she had finished explaining the situation, "you did the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing is expensive, but not doing it is even more expensive in the long run." Her mother's response was equally supportive, but more practical. "Elena, you need to protect yourself and make sure you have help. These are powerful people who will try to hurt you if they can. Find lawyers and other people who can stand with you." The advice was sound and reflected the hard-won wisdom of people who had navigated complex challenges throughout their lives. Maria spent the rest of the evening researching whistleblower protection laws, identifying attorneys who specialized in corporate fraud cases, and preparing detailed summaries of her findings for submission to appropriate regulatory authorities. The process was methodical and time-consuming, requiring her to translate her forensic analysis into language that would be accessible to lawyers, investigators, and eventually judges and juries. But with each hour of work, Maria's conviction grew stronger that she had made the right choice, regardless of the personal and professional costs she might face. Over the weekend, Maria submitted formal complaints to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Her documentation was thorough and professional, providing investigators with detailed roadmaps for understanding the complex scheme she had uncovered and the evidence needed to pursue criminal and civil enforcement actions. The federal response was remarkably swift. Within 10 days of receiving Maria's complaint, the SEC had opened a formal investigation into Teknova's financial practices. The FBI initiated its own parallel investigation, focusing on potential criminal violations of federal fraud and conspiracy statutes. The IRS began an extensive audit of the company's tax returns and started tracing the offshore transactions that Maria had identified in her analysis. Meanwhile, Alexander Reeves was dealing with the immediate aftermath of Maria's termination and trying to assess the potential damage from her investigation. His weekend had been consumed by emergency meetings with his personal attorneys, his public relations advisors, and his most trusted executives, all focused on developing strategies for containing what could become a catastrophic situation for both Teknova and his personal reputation. The lawyers were pessimistic about the company's exposure if Maria's allegations proved accurate and if she followed through on her implied threat to report her findings to regulatory authorities. Corporate fraud investigations could trigger not only criminal charges, but also civil lawsuits from shareholders, customers, and business partners. The regulatory fines alone could run into the hundreds of millions of dollars, while the damage to Teknova's reputation could destroy years of carefully built relationships and competitive advantages. But Reeves was not prepared to accept defeat without mounting an aggressive defense. He authorized his legal team to begin preparing responses to any potential charges, while his public relations firm developed strategies for managing media coverage and public perception. He also instructed his head of security to conduct a comprehensive review of Maria's access to company systems and to identify any other employees who might have similar concerns about the company's financial practices. The security review revealed both reassuring and troubling information. Maria appeared to have worked alone in her investigation, and no other employees had raised similar questions about the expense irregularities she had identified. But the thoroughness of her analysis and the quality of her documentation suggested that she possessed a level of forensic accounting expertise that was far beyond what her position should have required. Further investigation into Maria's background revealed educational and professional credentials that made her a particularly formidable adversary. She had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Washington with a double major in accounting and criminal justice, and she had completed internships with both the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and the Securities and Exchange Commission's Enforcement Division. During her graduate studies, she had specialized in forensic accounting and white-collar crime investigation, earning certifications that qualified her to serve as an expert witness in federal criminal trials. The realization that he had underestimated Maria Vasquez sent a chill through Reeves that had nothing to do with the November weather in Seattle. He had assumed that she was simply an over-eager junior employee who had stumbled across information she didn't understand and was trying to make herself look important by raising unfounded concerns. The truth was that she was a highly trained forensic accountant who had methodically uncovered a complex fraud scheme and documented it with the kind of professional expertise that could withstand scrutiny in federal court. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If Maria followed through on her threat to report her findings to regulatory authorities, she could provide investigators with exactly the kind of roadmap they would need to unravel his entire operation. Her documentation was thorough enough to serve as the foundation for search warrants, subpoenas, and the kind of comprehensive audit that would expose every aspect of the financial diversions he had so carefully concealed. On Monday morning, Reeves called an emergency meeting of Technova's senior executive team. The conference room on the 44th floor was filled with the company's most trusted leaders, men and women who had helped build Technova from a small startup into a global technology powerhouse with billions of dollars in annual revenue and operations in dozens of countries. But as Reeves explained the situation they now faced, he could see doubt and concern replacing the loyalty and confidence that had previously characterized their relationships with him and with each other. The revelation that one of their own employees had uncovered evidence of potential financial fraud was shocking enough, but the possibility that their CEO might be personally involved was almost incomprehensible. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reeves began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that his next words might determine the future of everything they had built together. "We have a situation that could potentially threaten the stability and reputation of this company." He outlined Maria's investigation in general terms, describing her allegations as misinterpretations of complex but legitimate business arrangements. But his explanation was vague and defensive, lacking the kind of specific details that would have been necessary to reassure executives who understood financial operations and regulatory requirements. Sarah Mitchell, Technova's chief financial officer, was the first to voice the concerns that everyone in the room was feeling. "Alex, if there are questions about our financial reporting or expense management, we need to address them transparently and immediately. Our fiduciary duty to shareholders and our legal obligations to regulatory authorities require us to investigate any credible allegations of irregularities." Dr. James Park, the company's chief technology officer and one of Reeves's oldest friends in the organization, nodded in agreement. "Sarah's absolutely right. If there are problems with our financial practices, we need to fix them before they become bigger problems. And we certainly can't afford to be seen as retaliating against employees who report legitimate concerns about corporate governance." But Reeves was not prepared to accept what he saw as defeatist thinking from his own leadership team. "The only problem we have is a disgruntled former employee who misinterpreted complex business arrangements and is now threatening to damage our company with her uninformed speculation and personal grievances." The explanation satisfied no one in the room, and the meeting quickly devolved into a series of heated exchanges about corporate responsibility, legal liability, and the proper response to employee allegations of financial irregularities. Several executives demanded immediate access to the documents Maria had identified, while others insisted on bringing in outside auditors to conduct an independent review of the company's financial practices and internal controls. Margaret Torres, the company's general counsel, was particularly vocal in her concerns about the legal implications of the situation. "Alex, regardless of whether we believe these allegations have merit, we have to assume that they will be reported to regulatory authorities and that we will face federal investigations. Our response needs to be guided by legal considerations, not by personal feelings about a former employee." Dr. Park, who had known Reeves since their graduate school days at Stanford, tried to appeal to their personal relationship and shared history. "Alex, we've built something incredible here. Something that genuinely makes the world a better place. Don't let pride or stubbornness destroy everything we've worked for. If there are problems, let's fix them and move forward." But Reeves's response revealed the extent to which his perspective had been distorted by years of unchallenged authority and growing paranoia about threats to his position. The only problem is that we've been infiltrated by someone who doesn't understand or appreciate what we've accomplished here. Maria Vasquez was never committed to this company's success. She was always looking for opportunities to advance her own career at our expense. The characterization of Maria as a disloyal opportunist was both unfair and strategically counterproductive, further alienating executives who had worked with her and respected her professionalism and integrity. Several people in the room had personal knowledge of Maria's dedication to her work and her genuine commitment to the company's mission and values. As the meeting concluded with no clear resolution and increasing tension between Reeves and his senior team, it became apparent that Teknova was facing not just a potential financial scandal, but a fundamental crisis of leadership and corporate governance. The consensus among the executive team was clear. The company needed to address Maria's concerns transparently and honestly, even if doing so created short-term difficulties for the organization and its leadership. That afternoon, Sarah Mitchell submitted her resignation, citing irreconcilable differences with Reeves over the company's response to the financial irregularities that had been identified. Her departure was followed within days by several other senior executives, creating a leadership crisis that made it difficult for Teknova to function normally and that sent alarming signals to investors, customers, and regulatory authorities. The exodus of senior leadership coincided with the beginning of federal investigations that would ultimately validate every aspect of Maria's analysis and expose the full scope of Reeves's fraudulent activities. Within 3 weeks of her termination, federal agents executed search warrants at Teknova's headquarters, seizing computers, financial records, and other evidence related to the suspected fraud scheme. The sight of FBI agents carrying boxes of documents out of the Meridian Tower was captured by news cameras and broadcast around the world, instantly transforming a local corporate scandal into a national story about corruption and abuse of power in the technology industry. The media coverage was devastating for both Teknova and Alexander Reeves personally, destroying years of carefully cultivated reputation and public relations in a matter of hours. But perhaps the most damaging coverage came from investigative journalists who used Maria's regulatory complaints as starting points for their own research into Teknova's financial practices and corporate culture. Their reporting uncovered additional evidence of irregularities and revealed a pattern of intimidation and retaliation against employees who had previously raised concerns about company policies and management practices. One particularly damning article in the Seattle Times featured interviews with several former Teknova employees who described a toxic workplace environment where fear and paranoia had replaced the innovation and collaboration that had originally made the company successful. The article painted a picture of an organization where questioning authority or raising concerns about ethical issues could result in termination, harassment, or professional retaliation. As the investigations continued and negative publicity mounted, Teknova's board of directors found themselves under increasing pressure from shareholders, regulators, and business partners to take decisive action to restore confidence in the company's leadership and governance. The board's response came 8 weeks after Maria's termination, in the form of a unanimous vote of no confidence in Alexander Reeves. He was removed as CEO and stripped of all operational authority, though he retained his position as a board member and major shareholder pending the outcome of the various federal investigations. The announcement of Reeves's removal sent Teknova's stock price soaring as investors interpreted the move as evidence that the company was taking the necessary steps to address its problems and rebuild its damaged reputation. But for Reeves personally, the decision represented the complete collapse of everything he had worked to achieve over the previous 8 years. The technology empire he had built from nothing was now under federal investigation. His personal reputation was in ruins, and his financial future depended on the outcome of criminal and civil proceedings that could result in decades in federal prison and hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and restitution. Meanwhile, Maria had used the months during the investigation to complete her master's degree in forensic accounting at the University of Washington and to gain additional experience working with federal investigators on other corporate fraud cases. Her reputation in the field had grown considerably, and she received job offers from major accounting firms, regulatory agencies, and corporate compliance departments throughout the country. The criminal charges against Alexander Reeves were announced on a cold February morning, exactly 4 months after Maria's termination. The federal indictment included 23 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, carrying potential penalties of up to 40 years in federal prison and over $200 million in fines and restitution. The announcement was accompanied by a joint press conference featuring representatives from the SEC, the FBI, the IRS, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Washington. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, praised the courage and professionalism of the whistleblower who had brought the scheme to light despite facing significant personal and professional risks. This case demonstrates the vital importance of employees who are willing to speak up when they witness wrongdoing in their organizations, Walsh said. Ms. Vasquez could have remained silent and avoided the personal and professional risks associated with challenging a powerful CEO and potentially losing her job. Instead, she chose to put the public interest ahead of her own immediate concerns, and her actions have helped protect investors and ensure accountability for serious corporate fraud. The press conference was covered extensively by national media, and Maria found herself thrust into the spotlight as a symbol of corporate whistleblowing and ethical behavior in the business world. Requests for interviews poured in from major news organizations, while speaking bureaus reached out to offer lucrative contracts for appearances at conferences, universities, and corporate training programs. But Maria remained reluctant to embrace her newfound celebrity status. She had never sought public attention for her actions, and she remained focused on the professional and personal challenges of rebuilding her career after taking on one of the most powerful figures in the technology industry. Her primary concern was ensuring that the legal proceedings against Reeves were successful and that other potential victims of corporate fraud would be encouraged to come forward with their own evidence and testimony. The legal proceedings against Reeves stretched on for over 18 months as his defense team mounted an aggressive challenge to the government's case. They argued that the financial arrangements Maria had identified were legitimate business transactions that had been mischaracterized by prosecutors who didn't understand the complexities of modern corporate finance and international business operations. The defense strategy attempted to portray Reeves as a visionary entrepreneur who had been brought down by a disgruntled employee seeking revenge and ambitious prosecutors looking to advance their careers by targeting a successful and prominent business leader. They challenged the admissibility of evidence, questioned the expertise of government witnesses, and argued that the financial transactions in question were authorized by appropriate corporate authorities and served legitimate business purposes. But the evidence against Reeves was overwhelming, and much of it came directly from Maria's meticulous documentation of the fraud scheme and her expert testimony explaining how the various transactions violated both accounting standards and federal law. Her analysis had provided investigators with a comprehensive roadmap for understanding the complex financial structures that Reeves had used to conceal his fraudulent activities. During the trial, Maria's testimony was particularly compelling as she walked the jury through her forensic analysis step by step, explaining in clear and accessible language how the various transactions had been designed to deceive auditors, regulators, and shareholders about the true nature of Technova's financial operations. Her professional credentials and obvious expertise made her a highly credible witness, while her calm demeanor and detailed knowledge of the evidence undermined the defense's attempts to portray her as a vindictive or unreliable accuser. The defense's attempt to characterize Maria as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge against her former employer backfired spectacularly when the prosecution introduced evidence of her exemplary work record, her genuine commitment to the company's mission, and the legitimate concerns she had raised about financial irregularities. Character witnesses testified about her integrity and professionalism, while expert witnesses confirmed the accuracy and sophistication of her forensic accounting analysis. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, Maria's former professor and thesis advisor at the University of Washington, testified about Maria's academic achievements and her specialized training in forensic accounting and fraud investigation. Ms. Vasquez was one of the most dedicated and talented students I encountered in over 20 years of teaching, Dr. Martinez told the jury. Her analysis of complex financial transactions was consistently thorough, accurate, and objective. She had no personal agenda other than ensuring that corporate financial reporting met the highest standards of accuracy and transparency. The jury deliberated for less than 12 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 23 counts. Reeves was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $51 million in restitution to Technova and its shareholders. The judge's sentencing remarks were particularly pointed in their criticism of Reeves's abuse of power and his attempt to silence Maria through intimidation and retaliation. Mr. Reeves violated not only federal law, but also the trust placed in him by employees, investors, customers, and business partners, Judge Patricia Chen said during the sentencing hearing. His attempt to silence Ms. Vasquez through threats and intimidation represents a particularly egregious aspect of his criminal conduct, demonstrating a complete disregard for the whistleblower protections that are essential to maintaining integrity in our financial markets and corporate governance systems. The conclusion of the criminal case marked the beginning of a new chapter for both Technova Industries and Maria Vasquez. The company, under new leadership, implemented comprehensive reforms to its financial reporting, internal controls, and corporate governance practices. Many of the executives who had resigned during the scandal returned to help rebuild the organization, while new hires brought fresh perspectives and renewed commitment to ethical business practices and transparency. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who had been recruited from Microsoft to serve as Technova's new CEO, made corporate culture and ethical leadership central to her reform agenda. She implemented new training programs for managers, established independent oversight committees, and created multiple channels for employees to report concerns about corporate governance without fear of retaliation. "We're not just trying to recover from a scandal," Dr. Morrison explained during her first company-wide meeting. "We're trying to build the kind of organization that could never experience this kind of scandal because our culture and systems prevent these problems from developing in the first place." The transformation was not easy or immediate, requiring sustained effort and significant investment in new personnel, systems, and training programs. But within 2 years, Technova had not only recovered its pre-scandal market valuation, but had achieved new levels of innovation and customer satisfaction under its reformed leadership and governance structure. Maria, meanwhile, had established herself as one of the leading experts in corporate fraud investigation and whistleblower protection. She completed her master's degree with a thesis on the effectiveness of federal whistleblower statutes, and her work was cited by researchers, policymakers, and legal practitioners throughout the country. But it was an offer from Technova itself that ultimately proved most appealing to Maria. Dr. Morrison personally recruited her to serve as Senior Vice President for Corporate Integrity and Compliance, with responsibility for ensuring that the financial irregularities that had nearly destroyed the company could never happen again. "Maria," Dr. Morrison said during their first meeting, "you've already proven that you have the skills, courage, and integrity to identify problems that others miss or choose to ignore. We need someone with your expertise and moral authority to help us build a culture where ethical behavior is not just encouraged, but expected, protected, and rewarded." The offer represented both vindication and opportunity for Maria. She would be returning to the company that had fired her for doing the right thing, but now she would have the authority, resources, and support necessary to ensure that other employees in similar situations would be protected rather than persecuted. Her acceptance of the position was announced at a company-wide meeting that drew extensive media coverage and attention from business schools and corporate governance experts around the world. Employees who had witnessed her termination and the subsequent scandal welcomed her return with enthusiasm and relief, seeing her appointment as evidence that Teknova was truly committed to changing its culture and operating practices. In her remarks to the assembled employees, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her back to Teknova and the lessons she had learned about courage, integrity, and the responsibilities that come with professional expertise and moral clarity. "2 years ago, I sat in my cubicle and discovered information that I knew would be difficult and dangerous to report," she told the audience. "I could have ignored what I found, focused on my own career prospects and financial security, and hoped that someone else would deal with the problems I had identified." She paused, looking out at the faces of employees who represented the future of the company and the technology industry more broadly. Many of them were young professionals, just beginning their careers, facing the same kinds of choices and challenges that had defined her own professional development. "But I learned from my parents that integrity is not something you can compromise when it becomes inconvenient or risky," Maria continued. "I learned from my education and professional training that expertise comes with obligations that don't disappear when they conflict with personal interests. And I learned from this experience that speaking truth to power, while never easy, is sometimes the only way to protect the things and people we care about." Her story became a case study in business schools, ethics programs, and law schools around the world, illustrating both the challenges and the importance of corporate whistleblowing in maintaining market integrity and corporate accountability. Her experience demonstrated that individuals with courage and conviction could successfully challenge even the most powerful figures in the business world, but only with significant personal sacrifice and the support of legal and regulatory systems designed to protect those who report wrongdoing. The reforms implemented at Teknova under Maria's guidance became a model for other technology companies seeking to rebuild trust with employees, investors, regulators, and the public. The company's stock price not only recovered, but eventually exceeded its pre-scandal levels, while its reputation for both innovation and ethical business practices attracted top talent from throughout the industry. Alexander Reeves, serving his sentence in a federal minimum security facility in California, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of corporate accountability and governance. His fall from billionaire technology mogul to convicted felon was studied by researchers interested in understanding how successful leaders can lose their moral compass and the warning signs that might prevent similar scandals in the future. For Maria, the experience had transformed not only her career trajectory, but also her understanding of her own capabilities, responsibilities, and potential for making a positive impact on the world. She had learned that standing up for principles, while difficult and risky, was also empowering and ultimately rewarding in ways that went far beyond financial compensation or professional recognition. 5 years after her confrontation with Alexander Reeves, Maria found herself testifying before a Senate committee investigating corporate fraud and the effectiveness of whistleblower protection laws. As Senior Vice President for Corporate Integrity at Technova and a nationally recognized expert in forensic accounting and corporate governance, she was uniquely qualified to provide insights about both the challenges facing potential whistleblowers and the reforms needed to encourage ethical behavior in corporate America. "Members of the committee," she began, her voice carrying the confidence and authority that came from years of experience in some of the most challenging situations the business world could offer. Corporate fraud is not just a matter of numbers on financial statements or regulatory violations that affect only investors and executives. It represents a fundamental betrayal of trust that undermines the entire system of market capitalism, democratic governance, and social progress that depends on honest business practices. As she spoke about the importance of whistleblower protections, the need for robust internal compliance programs, and the responsibility of corporate leaders to create cultures of integrity and accountability, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of national influence and professional accomplishment. The hearing room was packed with journalists, lobbyists, corporate executives, and academic researchers, all listening intently to her testimony about the reforms needed to prevent future scandals and protect employees who witness wrongdoing in their organizations. But Maria's thoughts drifted to her parents, now comfortably retired and living in a modest home in Bellevue, their sacrifices finally rewarded by their daughter's success and their own financial security. Roberto and Carmen Vasquez had taught her that wealth and status were less important than character and integrity, lessons that had proven more valuable than any formal education or professional training she had received. The courage she had shown in confronting Alexander Reeves had its roots in the values they had instilled during her childhood in a working-class neighborhood where honesty was more treasured than material possessions, and where standing up for others was considered both a privilege and a responsibility. As Maria concluded her testimony and prepared to answer questions from the senators, she realized that her story was far from over. The fight against corporate corruption and the protection of employees who report wrongdoing were ongoing challenges that required constant vigilance and the continued courage of individuals willing to speak up when they witnessed violations of law or ethics. But she also knew that her experience had proven something fundamental about the nature of power and accountability in democratic societies. No individual, regardless of wealth, position, or influence, was above the law or immune from the consequences of their actions. And no employee, regardless of their place in the corporate hierarchy, was powerless to make a difference when they possessed the courage to act on their convictions and the support of institutions designed to protect those who serve the public interest. The confrontation that had begun with Alexander Reeves shouting, "I caught you red-handed," had ultimately revealed that Maria Vasquez was indeed more honest than the billionaire CEO who had tried to intimidate her into silence. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that honesty, integrity, and moral courage were not just personal virtues, but essential elements of a functioning economic and political system that served the needs of all citizens, rather than just the wealthy and powerful. As she left the hearing room and walked through the halls of the Russell Senate office building, Maria carried with her the knowledge that her parents' lessons about the importance of doing the right thing had proven more valuable than any amount of money, power, or professional status. The young woman who had been fired for challenging a corrupt CEO had become a leader in the effort to ensure that future generations of employees would have the protection, support, and encouragement they needed to follow their own consciences and professional obligations. The story of Maria Vasquez and Alexander Reeves became more than just another corporate scandal or whistleblower case. It became a reminder that in a world where power and wealth often seem to determine the rules of engagement, individuals with courage, integrity, and specialized expertise can still make a difference. And sometimes, the quiet voice of an honest employee working late in a modest cubicle can be more powerful than the intimidating shouts of a billionaire CEO in his corner office overlooking the city he thought he controlled. Years later, when business students and ethics professors studied the Technova case, they would focus not just on the financial fraud or the legal proceedings, but on the moment when a young accountant chose principle over self-preservation, and in doing so, changed not only her own life, but the lives of thousands of employees, millions of shareholders, and countless others who would benefit from the reforms and cultural changes that followed from her courageous decision to speak truth to power.